Coming to you live from Bushy Synagogue, a particularly rare treat as we begin a 3-week period of mourning, but more importantly, contemplation and reflection. We are informed that the Rambam tells us that the point of any period of which we will use an opportunity either to fast or to mourn in some fashion, there must always be a reflective element connected to it. And I can think of nothing more significant as I've the joy and opportunity to join with my colleague and friend, Rabbi Daniel Friedman from Norris Lee Synagogue, who has championed Rabbi Sachs's teachings over his year of passing. Please God, all of you who are joining in with us in this in-conversation will have an opportunity to, therefore, not just mourn the loss of this wonderful man, but more importantly, continue to reflect upon his teachings and to keep him very much with us. Rabbi Friedman, it's wonderful to have you.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Feldman. It's an honor and a privilege to be here at Bushy United Synagogue, live on location, and to be continuing with our monthly Rabbinic Chavrusa, where I have the honor to learn with a different rabbi of a United Synagogue or Anglo-Jewry leader, really across the globe, because we have taken it across the Atlantic to Rabbi Robinson as well in New York. But speaking of New York, Rabbi Feldman, that's where you hail from, but you have found your place here in this country, leader of one of the largest shuls in the country. And such an honor to be in conversation with you this evening. And tonight we're going to be talking about one people. Now, I do notice that you and I have different editions, but it is the same book. So we're going to call it one book, even though the cover might be a little different. And I mean, before we get into the actual book itself, and I do want to thank our Bushy viewers and our Hampstead Garden Suburb viewers and all of our United Synagogue viewers and everyone tuning in this country and around the world. I also want to thank Rabbi Nick Kett, who is working all of the system this evening. I mean, this is the greatest tech that I have ever seen or been involved with. This is awesome. So thank you, Rabbi Kett, the wonderful associate rabbi here in Bushy. So before we get into the book itself, Rabbi Feldman, you had a relationship with Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Tell us a little about your relationship with him and the impact that he had on your life.
Not many people know that Rabbi Sachs Zatzal, rather than being laid to rest where most of the chief rabbis are laid to rest in Willesden Cemetery, is actually in Bushy New Cemetery. And therefore, as my local patch, I tend to spend quite a bit of time in the new cemetery. And therefore, I find myself saying hi to Rabbi Sachs on a regular basis. They've yet to erect a proper matzeva for him. And therefore, all you have is his burial plot with a number of small stones and pebbles placed as the markers of honor, and just a card that distinguishes him as the chief rabbi from regular rabbis with the title of Morei Morenu. And Morei Morenu does not mean that he is the greatest of the great. He means that he is the teacher of the teachers. And perhaps more than any other chief rabbi before him, the title of being the teacher of teachers is so appropriate. Just today, I was on the phone with one of my congregants, and he shared with me a personal teaching that he received from Rabbi Sachs. And I would like to think that all of us, in many ways, are actually disciples, either directly or indirectly, of Rabbi Sachs. For me personally, I came into the rabbinate just at the right time. It was when Rabbi Sachs already saw, as it were, the finish line. He knew that he was on his way, concluding his tenure, and he was looking to build the future. And therefore, he took under his wings the young rabbanim of the time. We had very much in the same way that we are sharing a chabura or a chavruta, a one-on-one or a small group fashioned discussion and learning program between the two of us. I got to do that with the chief rabbi, with Rabbi Sachs. And it was within those close quarters, I was able to really see his love, but also his vision as well. And although there are a few stories that I could share about my personal experiences that I had with him in his lifetime, I suppose the most poignant one for me was after he passed away. And the Levaya had taken place. This, of course, was during the height of the COVID period, where numbers were very restricted, but they had somehow managed to have nights of Shiva, of which there would only be allowed a very, very specific amount of people to attend, 15 or whatever it was at the time. And I was asked to speak at one of the Shivas. And this was not just a unique honor, but a bit of a shock, because I certainly had not known him the longest, and I most certainly wasn't the most qualified. But all I was told is that the family have requested thus. So, one of the evenings I made my way to Dunstan Road, to Golders Green Synagogue, tried to, in some way, communicate my feelings for Rabbi Sachs. Then afterwards, I sat next to Lady Sachs, and she said to me, first of all, thank you. And I said, but why am I here? And she said, because it was so important to Rabbi Sachs that his teachings would continue into the next generation. And as a representative of that next generation, I was given the task, along with all of my other colleagues, to pick up the mantle. And that, to me, every time I walk by the Moreh Morenu, I just hear the echoes of Rabbi Sachs saying, Nu Elchanan, have you gone on with it? I would like to hope that tonight might be just a small piece of that puzzle.
Well, that's very powerful. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for sharing that inspirational piece. To think that Rabbi Sachs was already, so to speak, planning the Shiva, but doing it in such a meaningful way that would impart a message, to the next generation. So, Rabbi Feldman, one people, tradition, modernity, and Jewish unity. One of Rabbi Sachs's earliest works, maybe the first one as chief rabbi, I'm not sure, but one of them, I think back in 93, one of the earlier ones. And I must say, not an easy book. I think a lot in this book. Why did you choose this particular book for us to discuss this evening?
Well, in retrospect, Rabbi Sachs has always been known as very clever. But perhaps what's less appreciated is how nuanced he has always been. And some would say that every single one of his many writings was all culminating in his eventual magnum opus, as he would conclude in more recent times with his latest works. And as you said, this is one of the beginning ones. But perhaps because it was one of the earlier ones, in some ways it's less guarded. He has not had, at that point in time yet, the weight of the chief rabbinate upon him. He's not yet been broken by the servitude of the various contentious strains that tried in many ways to monopolize what his chief rabbinate's messaging could be.
That's so interesting. I mean, that's so true when you read this. It's very raw, very raw.
And perhaps when you're looking for answers, maybe going to the polished, shorter versions, more compacted, even pithy lines. Sometimes the genius is actually in the text, as long as you have the capacity to look for it. So I wanted to look at the earlier writings, the subjects of what it means to be a peoplehood, picking apart what orthodoxy is and what it's not, and looking at the modernity of the societies we live in, and whether that's something to embrace or the great enemy to avoid.
Interesting, interesting. Well, thank you. Let's get straight into it. So, what we will do is we'll each look at a chapter. We've each chosen a couple of chapters that we will expound upon and then engage in conversation about it. So, Rabbi Feldman will begin with chapter 1. Tell us about it.
So, chapter 1 is referred to as the crisis of contemporary Jewish thought. Crisis is a big word, but he does not use it lightly. He starts off in this chapter by presenting what the crisis actually is and how it connects to Jewish contemporary thought. And he uses a parable of Alistair MacIntyre in order to achieve that. Now, Alistair MacIntyre is not particularly talking about Judaism. He's talking about modernity, full stop. And he says as follows: imagine that there's a time in which you have a dystopian society that has fallen apart because of some type of upheaval in which science is blamed as the culprit. And in that riotous, chaotic anarchy, we find ourselves that all the foundations, all of the houses of study, all of the laboratories, all of the universities are all destroyed. And science, as a consequence, is forgotten. A new generation, though, arises, remembering promises of what science could herald. And through the ashes and through the debris, they try to piece together science. They make a great effort at it. And at their conclusion, they have erected what they understand to be science. The problem is that it's a mere shadow of what science was. And it has the same names. It has the same titles. But the substance isn't there. And therefore, without the substance, the science that has changed and moved technology in a positive way would be forgotten. Of course, he therefore brings it back into modernity, in which you have principles of virtue, principles of morality, principles of ethics that have become disconnected from their sources, from why they emerged, how they emerged, upon which foundations they had emerged in. And as a result of that, all you're left is a shadow of morality, a shadow of virtue, a shadow of ethics. And in that environment, there could be no real, pure, ethical, modern, moral standards. Says Rabbi Sacks, what would happen if you replaced the word modernity, the word virtue, with the word Judaism? And we have the same names as our forefathers had. We have the words mitzvah. We have the words Torah. We have the words tikkun. We have the words Am Yisrael, Knesset Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael. And we think we know what they mean. But because in the modernity, in today's society, disconnected from its original roots, from its original foundations, they become shallow, hollow shells of what they originally were. He gives a real example, going straight into the meat of things. The Declaration of Independence of Israel, this formative document from May 1948, which outlines the principles of how the democratic new Medinat Yisrael would exist and on what basis it would exist. And he says, look at the concluding lines. I'll use the English translation. Placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, Tzur Yisrael. We set our hands to the declaration at the session at the Provisional State Council in the city of Tel Aviv this Sabbath Eve, and then goes on to say on the 5th of ER 5708, 14th of May, 1948. Says Rabbi Sachs, well, what does the Rock of Israel mean? We once upon a time knew Sur Yisrael. That's how we enter into our Midah. That's how we enter into our Shemona Esrei. Did it mean, therefore, God Almighty, Rock of Israel? Or perhaps did the writers mean something very different? When we talk about the eve of Sabbath, well, what's Sabbath now? Is it our Brit Olam, our connection with Hashem, this eternal bond? Or perhaps is it a society's day of rest? And are we using the Gregorian secular calendar to refer to our system of time? Or are we reusing the religious one? Says Rabbi Sachs, introducing the problem, the crisis that we find ourselves in, is that we are in a world today where modernity has made Judaism a beaten adversary. And in the place of being a beaten adversary, what is our identity? And in that identity, can there possibly be a peoplehood? And what would it look like? It's a big chapter.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Feldman. So let me know your thoughts. So I think that's a radical idea that Rabbi Sachs presents, that the Judaism that we call Judaism today might be something different to following the decay of having left previous existences, previous countries, and that we had some kind of rupture between something that we had previously and something that we know today. In your mind, is it that stark? Or do we have that linear progression? It's certainly not a completely radical idea. We have notions amongst the medieval commentators about machlokas, that says that the reason we have debates in the Talmud is because things did get forgotten and they had to be reconstructed. So it wouldn't be a completely radical idea. But to say that the Judaism we have in 20th, 21st century is somehow not linearly connected to 17th, 18th, 19th century Judaism, to me might be just that little bit of a jump. Your thoughts?
Well, he refers to it as a crisis, and I'll take him on his word. He has exclaimed, and he'll continue on in some of the later chapters to discuss as well, that what secularism has brought to the world in many ways has been more devastating to the Jewish communities than any churban, any proper exile or destructive time period before.
Right.
Those are radical words.
Sure.
In which, principally, he says, whereas the previous losses have been the principle of hester panim, not being able to see Hashem, to see God's hand in our life. That has its challenges. But Rabbinic Judaism found ways of overcoming them, moving to what would eventually be referred to as orthodoxy. The problem today is much more profound in his eyes, and that is, we don't even know what Judaism means. So there could be a narrative, there can be a covenant, but if you and I are sitting here together and we can't even agree on what it means to be Jewish, that was never a problem before. Everyone knew what it meant to be Jewish, and either you left it, depending on which generation, which century, would depend on why you left it. But if you left it, you knew what you were leaving. Now we have a situation where we may be in it and still at the same time have no idea what we have, and certainly not be able to agree on it.
Right.
That he refers to as a crisis.
Right. No, absolutely. There should be up for debate as to the very essence of what Judaism is. It's very powerful and something that we probably haven't seen. Although, let's move on to chapter 2, if I may, and let's try and unpack that a little. So, number two, chapter 2, he calls the birth of the adjectival Jew. So instead of just being known as a Jew, I am now an Orthodox Jew, a liberal Jew, a Sephardic Jew, Ashkenazic Jew, but primarily these ideas that have come about only in the last few centuries that have differentiated various types of Jews. Now, he says previously, and he quotes Rav Saadia Gaon, 9th century, he says, Rav Saadia Gaon said, "We are a nation by virtue of common commitment to halacha." So we all knew that we were part of this halachic framework. Halacha was the common language, and therefore, if anybody stepped outside of the realm of halacha, they were no longer part of the covenantal community of the Jewish people. You were no longer part of being Jewish. But then Judaism to mean something else outside of the realm of halacha, that's a new idea. So just to pause there for a moment, and certainly I think that he tries to finesse this as we work through the book, I will say that one of the things I struggled with was Karaism. Now, the way that Rabbi Sacks contrasts, you've got Pharisees and Sadducees, you've got Rabbinites and Karaites. There are other contrasts that he makes that we might get to. But in all of these cases, he kind of suggests that, well, since they step outside the community, they are done. Now, I'm just not sure that that's a completely accurate depiction. Later in the book, he does mention that Karaites were accepted into regular schools in the 19th century, and we know till today, I think there are some 40, 50,000 Karaites still in the world, 40,000 in Israel and 10,000 in the diaspora. They practice some sort of non-halachic Judaism, and yet we have somehow managed to keep them in the fold. There were a lot more before the Holocaust. A lot of Karaite communities wiped out, and really the remnant today is the remnant of the Egyptian Karaite community. So to simply say that, well, if they weren't within the realm of halacha, therefore they weren't within the realm of Judaism, and this is the first time we see that with the advent of reform and secularization and the Enlightenment. I'm just not 100% sure that that's quite the case, but certainly I think that his argument is no less poignant as he takes us through. One of the other things I struggled with, I think, is his tendency, or it's really our tendency, and he does mention that it's not so simple because he already questions, the past couple of centuries it not being the case. I think sometimes we wax nostalgic about life in Dehaim. The way it was back in Europe when everybody was from and everybody looked like Tevye. And I think probably from Tevye's story itself, it becomes very clear that life wasn't so rosy back in Dehaim. And you can look in medieval times to Rabbi Moshe Kusi in the beginning and his intro to the Sefer Mitzvah Skottel, where he talks about going around the countryside, putting mezuzahs on people's doors and getting them to put on tefillin. Not everybody was doing it. Actually, we don't even have to exaggerate that far. We can just look into the Tanakh and see that our prophets are getting up telling everybody, well, don't worship idols, by the way. So this notion where it's nice to look back and say, well, everybody was part of that halachic community, everybody was homogeneous, worked in a uniform way. Nice as a theory to start from. Whether it was absolutely the case in practice, hard to know. He talks about when Samuel Holtheim came, and one of the early reformers, and he said that the point was that laws were there to keep us together as a nation, and now that we no longer needed Jewish nationalism because we were being accepted as German nationals, maybe we didn't need laws anymore, and we could now abide by our law system could be Dina de Malchusa. The law of the land becomes our law as Jews as well. And I think that makes one really think what it is to be Jewish and what's my purpose. And if I don't have halacha, and those early reformers who had other goals, then what am I aiming for? If I'm happy simply to be a citizen of the land and that's enough for me as a Jew, then what's my purpose in life? What am I aiming for? And I think that it's a reminder for us that the mitzvahs are more than just things that keep us together as Jewish people. These are what bind us to God. And every time we do a mitzvah, that's achieving more in this world, achieving more to be able to refine my neshama and be able to grow as a Jew and a human being and as a neshama. Then moves on, and there was a lot in chapter 2, but just a couple more ideas. He says that orthodoxy recognizes pluralism, but not the kind of pluralism that non-orthodox denominations of Judaism recognize. So what's the pluralism that we recognize? And this is a common theme throughout his books, is we certainly recognize that there's a role for Jews and non-Jews. We recognize within Orthodox Judaism that there are many ways to serve God. Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Hasidic, Litvish, and beyond. All of those pluralistic ways within the realm of halacha. What we don't recognize within Orthodox Judaism, and he's very emphatic about this, is whether it is the notion of other forms of non-halachic Judaism. He says that orthodoxy doesn't expand to that. That cannot fit within. If that's the definition of pluralism, then that won't work for us. And he brings one example of an Orthodox thinker who did believe in pluralism. That is Rabbi Yitz Irving Greenberg, and Rabbi Sacks certainly distances himself from Rabbi Greenberg's thinking. And he says, no, my reading of orthodoxy is that it's just not compatible with denominational thinking. And I know this, recently in the news, one of the teachers in our community had, mentioned that, she has no time for differences, denominational issues. But Rabbi Sacks makes it very clear that it's a key point of what defines orthodoxy, the ability to be able to say there's only one form of halachic framework, and if it's not that, then it's somehow, like you mentioned, it's a little raw in the early days, but then it's somehow outside the realm of traditional Judaism. Okay, well, your thoughts?
Well, a lot to unpack there. Perhaps the most, just coming off of what you've said, we didn't like to think of Rabbi Sacks as a traditionalist, did we? But in many ways, he felt so sincerely that it was his job to carry the Masorah. And he never wavered from that at any point. And although at the same time he did carry a lens of, or a voice of an ambassador, not just to the outside world, but perhaps to corners of our own Jewish soul that weren't ready for the Masorah, for the tradition just then. But he never ever shifted from the words that in his early days he felt safe to proclaim so clearly, which is, yes, we are a pluralistic faith, religion, however you want to describe what it means to be a Jew. But there is emet, there is truth, and there is what is outside that, which will eventually, in his view, separate from the orthodoxy or from Judaism, as he referred to it. Rabbi Friedman, though, I did have a bit of a question on what it means to be an adjectival, however you pronounce it.
I'm not sure if the I is a strong I or a soft I, but yes.
What it means to have a hyphen next to Jew. And you said that refers to different types of denominations, which is absolutely true. But an evening like this evening, in which you had English Jews dancing on their sofas, singing at the top of their lungs, "It's coming home." The hyphen's very, very strong there. And equally, I would imagine, in Munich or Frankfurt or Berlin right now. There are many dejected German hyphenated Jews who, perhaps some who are actually living in the UK, who are having a difficult evening right now. And my question for you is, where is there a place to have a dual identity of, at the one hand, being a Jew, but at the same time also being a national as well? He doesn't talk about that as much, but what's your feeling on what Rabbi Sachs would say about that?
Right, so certainly, yeah, Rabbi Feldman, he doesn't address it in this book. He addresses it in some of the other books, such as his book on building our home together. I think it's called, the one that I did with Rabbi Epstein at Southgate when he was at Southgate. And so I think absolutely, Rabbi Sachs was very much one to embrace his identity and our identity as British Jews and Jewish Brits. I think that's something that he, probably more than any chief rabbi in the history of the chief rabbinate, was very much a proud Brit and very much represented the best of both worlds. He had made it in both worlds. Here he was, someone who was consulted by prime ministers, and both during his chief rabbinate and afterwards. And we had the Prince of Wales mourning his loss. So certainly in that regard, Rabbi Sachs was very much able to sustain and maintain both, because they weren't in any way concessionary, compromising of one another. There were two identities that worked. Whereas when we have the identity that in some way compromises or minimizes the other one, such as a Judaism that has a hyphenating factor to it, that's where Rabbi Sachs took issue. And I think, I mean, you read it here, and just for the sake of our viewers, just to make it very clear, my earlier comments were from the perspective of Rabbi Sachs. I think that in the early days, just reading this, we would almost call him a kanai, a zealot, and we're familiar with the story of when he didn't go to Rabbi Grin's funeral, and I'm not sure that would have been Rabbi Sachs at the end of his chief rabbinate, but it is interesting to see his perspective at this point, and especially his struggle, the tension. He wanted to be able to produce a theology, a dogma of one people, and these were his real struggles that he's working out to say, how can I do it when this is what's going on? And undoubtedly, as he worked through on the ground, dealing with non-Orthodox colleagues, I think he found that pragmatically there are ways to get around what maybe black and white on paper is a little more difficult.
I think that's right. And that really brings us into chapter 3 and chapter 4, which I took a look at. I'll go to chapter 4 first, and then back into chapter 3 to maybe give it a bit of time to settle some of the thoughts about the hyphenated dual identities, which clearly Rabbi Sachs champions so well. He makes some distinctions between ideological divisions and institutional divisions. And he says, because institutionally in the UK, in Anglo Jewry, there were concessions made at a certain point in time in which the chief rabbinate / United Synagogue body chose to adapt themselves in a way that could fit firmly well into modernity. The canonicals came in, the choirs came in, even the Sidurim themselves were the same size and thickness as the Book of Common Prayer from the C of E, from the Church of England. And he says, because these concessions were made, the fact that in practice different people might have observed more or might have observed less. But at the end of the day, they can all fit under the broad church of the United Synagogue. And that's the reason why the other denominations did not take hold here. Obviously, they existed, but did not have as much weight or influence, because institutionally we were all able to fit, even if ideologically we couldn't. Whereas in Eastern Europe, eventually in Western Europe as well, where the concessions had not been made. Yes, Rav Hirsch, in his own way, with Torah and Derech Eretz, attempted to have a synthesis to create this neo-orthodoxy as a way of saying, yes, Frankfurt, you can embrace modernity as a bracha, as a blessing, while staying true to being a traditional Jew. But by and large, it wasn't like that. The responses to modernity was to build ghettos, was to build walls in order to protect our way of life. There, the ideological differences, because the institutions were further apart, created the chasms or the schisms that really could not be bridged. But in chapter 3, he does kick off with the earlier versions of what we now call Judaism, or what we now call Orthodoxy. And basically, it's the way my father refers to himself when asked, well, what denomination are you? And he says, I'm a Torah Jew. Because once upon a time, that's what we were. We were a Torah Jew in the sense that it was our job to be faithful to the Torah mission, to be faithful to the covenant with Hashem, in which there was a destiny for us as the bearers of his Torah. And therefore, we woke up in the morning and we knew what our mission was. And when we were on our last breath, in whatever scenario that might have been, we were breathing our last breath, hopefully true to being part of that mission. And therefore, every conflict with modernity was always going to be a question of, do you accommodate or do you resist? All with the same mission intact. What will enable the mission to stay true further or not? And he says, even from the earliest of times, this tension between accommodation and resistance was very much a discussion. He referred to Ezekiel, the prophet, as the one who said, don't get comfortable. Remember that we're supposed to be back in our land. And then you had Jeremiah, on the other hand, who said, embrace the society that you're in, because through it, in exile, you'll be able to thrive. And therefore, I wonder if the position of Rabbi Sacks, and I do believe truly that he was a student of Jeremiah more than Ezekiel, perhaps what we say to be true about Judaism or Orthodoxy, as Rabbi Sacks would want it to be perpetuated, being one that could command that duality, I believe it wasn't because they weren't in conflict with one another that they could somehow coexist. I believe he felt it was part of the Torah mission of what it means to be a Torah Jew and part of that covenant.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Absolutely. It was really, Rabbi Sacks always felt that, how could Jews impact society, impact the world? And you're right, it's part and parcel. This was the ultimate.
Yeah, and it does therefore then beg the question, how do we look at orthodoxy? Because that's the part of the book that I was really the most intrigued by. Yes, there are certainly going to be challenges of the schism between the denominations, which is looked at. But how can we become fragmented as a people, even within orthodoxy? How did that go so wrong? If we all believe in the Torah mission, and we do, and we all believe in this concept of Knesset Yisrael, of being a peoplehood, as the only way to accomplish that mission, then how did the judgments go so wrong? Where we could find that I could have more in common, and he says this, quoting a rabbi, with, and I'll use it more in a more um, uh, relevant application. How could I be in Wembley this evening, sitting next to a non-Jewish Gentile England supporter, and have more common with him in that crowd than I would with a chassid in Mea Shearim? How did that happen? And that's something which he is deeply bothered by. And he uses strong language. The sin of that we do not feel that peoplehood, even within the parameters that still consider themselves to be part of the Torah mission, he said the sin of that cannot be forgiven on Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur itself will only atone for Knesset Yisrael. And if we have divorced ourselves from being part of a peoplehood, then we're not on that train.
Right, right. So I think certainly a concern, a major concern, and I think he answers it. You've clarified a lot for me, I think, in terms of chapter 5 being really an answer to that, in that he says people get confused as to where the lines of dispute should be. He distinguishes between halacha and what he primarily calls agada, but he notes that colloquially we would probably call it today hashkafa. And halacha, he says, there is a consensus around a norm of what it means to be a Torah Jew. But then it's the agada, which is the gray area, where you can have two different opinions that are simultaneously true and simultaneously able to be maintained despite the fact that they don't agree whatsoever. Why? Because they don't have any impact on what it means to be halakha observance. So, hashkafically, do I have to believe that the state of Israel is Reshit Tzmichat Gulateno, the beginning of the sprouting of our redemption? Does that make any difference as to whether I can, daven with somebody in a minyan or sit on a basin with another rabbi because we have different hashkafas regarding the state of Israel? No, practically speaking, it's outside of the realm of halacha. And he says that all too often people get that confused and they forget what's the halachic realm where we have consensus and we have so much more that unites us than divides us. We know what that is. And then the agadic, that we can agree to disagree and we shouldn't feel any antipathy towards anybody else or alienation towards anybody else simply because they have different ideas on the way the world works. And when we remember that, then I think that we can move forward as a nation, come together as a nation. I'm going to just kind of move. That's what he does in chapter 5. But knowing that the hour is late, let's just some of his ideas in chapter 7, and then maybe we can pull it all together. Is his vision for how we increase the social cohesion amongst the Jewish people is he takes an idea from the sociology of religion that groups three different attitudes towards how I view myself and my relationship with religion versus anyone else. There's an exclusivist attitude that says I'm right, everyone else is wrong. There's a pluralist attitude that says I'm right, you're right, different paths, we can all be right. And then there's something in between that's called inclusivism that says I'm right, but I can see something within what you're doing that's also right. You're not absolutely right, but there's some redeeming factor within your behavior that I can somehow find common ground with. I think that it's not absolutely right what you're doing, but on that common ground, we can build that social cohesion. He says, and this is really what's amazing to me, to see the tension and the struggle within, and to say, I don't think that, well, certainly not myself, I can't speak for you, but I think that he says some things in here that, almost pull that community apart. Admits to where the fault lines are between Orthodoxy and Reform, or anything outside of the realm of the halakhic community, and says, we're just going to have to get past this because I admit that this is a problem. I'll give you an example. This one, to me, very powerful. He says, what do we do about avoiding, if someone is married in a Reform synagogue, then they're divorced in a Reform ceremony. Then they remarry in a Reform synagogue and have children. Theoretically, in the realm of halakha, we could have an issue of mamzerut, right? That illegitimately conceived because there was no divorce that happened with a proper get. He says Rav Moshe Feinstein solved it. He said, well, we just don't recognize the first marriage. And if we're annulling the first marriage, then there was no marriage to begin with. And so there was no need for a get. He says this is wonderful from an inclusivist perspective, but it's highly defamatory and derogatory towards our Reform colleagues, because essentially we're delegitimizing even their ability to perform a marriage now. So from our perspective, it seems inclusivist. From their perspective, it seems that what have we achieved? So this is the direction he wants to go. I'm not sure that he ever lands. Your thoughts, Rabbi Feldman? Does he ever land on a solution, do you feel, in this book?
Well, I think so. I think he, just to take a statement, which he says was, decisions should be judged by their consequences, not by the construction placed upon them. A pragmatic view on peoplehood rather than a strident one. But to me, ultimately, the end parts of this book is really a cry for help, in which he said, can't we all just get along? And why can't we recognize the examples that he gives about the new existence of a Jew who decides to stay a Jew even if they're not embracing the Torah mission? That's never happened before. And the fact that they have included themselves in, they want to be liyot mi Yisrael, to remain within the fold. How can that in any way remove them from being worthy of being part of peoplehood? So yes, if we are all on the same page where we are recognizing each other not by our distinctions but what unites us, then we'll find solutions. And those solutions will be bumpy, they'll be ill-fitted, but they will enable us to stay together. And I think when he wrote this in the late 80s into the early 90s, I think he was calling out and saying, there's still time. At least in Anglo Jewry. I don't know if he could have written this in 2021.
So it's funny you say that, because I actually had the opposite conclusion. I thought to myself, you know what? Maybe when he wrote it was too early. And I think about, for example, Israel, where he says, I don't know what the future is going to be with Israel. And you look even at the most recent elections and the coalition coming together across such strange fault lines. And even the commentary about the Haredi parties that are now in opposition and the way that they're talking about the Jewish nature of the state of Israel in ways that they never spoke before, because they never cared about the state of Israel. It was only, we are here and just to get out of the state of Israel dollars for yeshiva funding. But now they're suddenly talking a different language. And, we're looking at a blip. We're looking at a blip in history. I mean, how long are we talking about? And somehow things do sort themselves out. And that's why I say, I think about some of our riffs. Think about Hasidim and Misnagdim. I'm sure if we'd been talking in the early first couple of generations, we'd say, this is going to lead to a complete divide amongst the Jewish people. It sorted itself out. And I think that that's what we're seeing. And I think that, Rabbi Sachs, wanted solutions. Sometimes it's not about finding the solutions. It's just about getting along and not always knowing to a T what those solutions are.
Well, absolutely. And ultimately, this was a book of optimism, not pessimism. And we have to remember that. And earlier on in the chapters, he says that one of the reasons why he's so optimistic is because he has history on his side. And this is exactly what you said. He said Jewish destiny is a sustained defiance of history.
Absolutely.
And perhaps as we're nearing towards, especially in light of the 3 weeks, um, hopefully towards the Ketz Hayamim, towards the conclusion of days, maybe as a peoplehood, there is a strong way for us to go forward if we have the will to do so.
Yeah, amen. I mean, we know that this is the time that we need to increase that avas chinam, loving one another for no reason. The same way that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed for sinas chinam, we are here to love one another simply because they are our brother and sister. Thank you so much, Rabbi Feldman, for hosting me here this evening. It's been lovely, a pleasure to learn with you, and please God, we'll have many more opportunities to learn together in the future.
Thank you, and what a wonderful mission. And I'm so glad to be part of it, and I only hope that the messages of Rabbi Sachs continue to penetrate into the hearts of humanity, a voice that is so desperately needed and continues to echo far beyond the grave. May all of this continue to be a merit to his dear soul.
Amen.